There was a point made earlier on, why is change taking so long to happen? And Ian Allenson flagged up right at the very beginning this issue around investment and finance. And I think this is particularly pertinent now in this country because of the issues, or at least the priorities around economic development and the lack of regulation and government intervention. My work focuses, or my particular interest is in two areas. Why we seem unable to consider long-term impact, and why we can't build that long-term impact into our current decision-making. And secondly, why we can't value those things which are difficult to value, the things that we can't easily put metrics to, like well-being. So, as most of you don't know me, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm going to talk about these two problems as I see them, and then I'm talk about three different research projects that I'm working on, which is trying to unpick this conundrum. I work with a number of different universities on these research projects, but I wanted to, well, particularly University of Bath, who I've been working with on all three, but I wanted to flag up my old university, University West of England, just because it underlies a central principle, a central point that I'm trying to make of this disconnect between things like health and sustainability and urban planning. So there are 700 collaborating centres around the world, World Health Organization collaborating centres in 80 different countries, but only 2 of them are in faculties for the built environment. And arguably the one in Kobe in Japan is not a faculty for the built environment. So colleagues at University West of England have been sort of beavering away over the last 10, 15 years trying to link public health. And when I talk about health, I mean sustainability. There is a famous quote by US cultural historian Thomas Berry, which says that you can't have well humans on a sick planet. So when I say health, I'm talking about sustainability as well. So the type of work that we've been doing over the last 3 years since I've been an independent, but working with them, this is just to give you a sort of flavour of that. We were working with South Gloss Council to try and help them integrate health and sustainability into the urban extension of North Bristol. We're working on the Bristol Arena, again doing health impact assessment for that project, and likewise another super major development in central Bristol. Most of our work has been in and around Bristol in the southwest. It looks like this. We basically get a bunch of people into a room to talk through the main issues and try and improve all the different areas that need improving. So that's my sort of consultancy hat, if you like. I've also been in a very privileged position in that I'm a director on my family's development company. This is a scheme we delivered back in 2007. I must admit, this was sort of over 10 years ago. Actually, no, it's 8 years ago, isn't it? But it started before then. So I was only involved relatively peripherally at the time. But I mention this because it's allowed me to gain an insight into strategic level decision making, if you like, and the importance particularly of control. Control of land in particular, control of finance, and control of delivery. Because without those things, it becomes nigh on impossible to try and create change in any meaningful way. So the problem number one that I identified is about short-termism, and obviously you're all very, very familiar with this. I wanted to put it into context of urban development and urban development planning. So we have these amazing fantasies about the types of places that we would like to create. But what happens is we have these existing governance structures that dictate the delivery mechanisms that end up producing things which are neither healthy nor sustainable. We know that it can be done, but there are precious few examples worldwide, and we've been talking about this place for years because there are so few examples of it happening. And so just to finish up on this problem, and I was really really pleased and happy to see this. If you haven't read this speech, it's quite dense, it's quite long. It's by Andy Haldane, who's the chief economist of the Bank of England. And the speech is all about how corporate structures are governed and the history of corporate governance over the last 200, 300, 400 years and more, and how we've got to the situation that we have in this country in terms of particularly publicly floated companies. So one of the main reasons why these decisions are made in terms of strategic level governance is because of the evidence that they have, or more importantly, they don't have available to them. And my particular interest is in, because money makes the world go round, unfortunately, is in the financial side of things. Obviously, this has already been alluded to already. I think the key point for me here is that he said once climate change becomes a defining issue for financial stability, it may already be too late. His point is that we don't have decision tools, we don't have evidence, and particularly we don't have financial evidence that will enable our decision makers to make the sorts of changes that we're all hoping to see happen. There's emerging evidence, there's loads of emerging evidence that these external costs, because they are external, the decisions that are made do not factor in these costs. There's emerging evidence that these costs are very substantial. This is the cost of obesity, estimated by McKinsey and Company last year. This is just to the NHS in this country. And to put that in perspective, the whole of Europe committed just 1 billion to the refugee crisis. So we are spending 47 times that amount on treating people with obesity because they can't access green space, they can't get good food, whatever the reason is. And it's not just about urban planning. Urban planning is just one part of a much bigger picture. And it's not just health, it's also assets. We've had something earlier on which was 100 billion. This was a report by the Urban Land Institute which estimated that it was 150 billion per year. More scary than that is that it's tripled globally over the past decade. And this is a project which hopefully all of you are familiar with. There was people speaking at Resilience15 last year about this project. £5 million programme, 42 projects. And there was a report that came out afterwards about the business case for climate change adaptation and how you could design buildings to be more resilient to climate change. And it was all about government intervention. Basically saying there isn't a business case, and as I said earlier on, in the current government that we have and the economic constraints that we have, this is a particular challenge. So what are the solutions? Well, quite frankly, I don't know, but I'm hoping that some of our research will help to unpick this. So we were fortunate enough to win a project funded by the Wellcome Trust. For those of you who don't know the Wellcome Trust, they're one of the largest, along with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they're one of the largest investors in health research. Now, traditionally, their research has been into biomedical and clinical health, stuff that you do in a lab. But recently, they've realized, because they're working with people who are interested in this area, that actually there's going to be very considerable health impact from overpopulation, from climate change, from rapid urbanization. So they have funded 15 pilots, of which ours is one. And out of those, out of the 10 in the second tranche, ours was one of only 2 to be focusing on the built environment, on urbanization. The other 8 were on food, things like can you eat insects and how are we going to feed ourselves and things like that. So it's a new area for them. They're used to being able to run tests in laboratory conditions. And what we're talking about here is very, very complex systems type analysis, which is not their area at all. But they've been convinced by these pilots, and they've just announced a £75 million investment in an expansion of this program, which they're going to award to only 5 projects. So it's going to be £10 million projects each. So a fairly considerable investment. Just to give you a sort of sense of the people that we're working with on this project, to give it a sense of scale, and also I'll explain about what we're trying to do very briefly after that. So Greater Manchester Combined Authority we're going to be working with, and they're a very interesting case study because they're now responsible for their £6 billion health budget. In theory, this means that somewhere at the top of the pile, there's going to be someone who's not only responsible for city and urban planning, but also someone who's responsible for their health. We've yet to see how that's going to play out. Redrow, who most of you are probably aware is a volume house builder, Cherwell District Council, who are the planning authority responsible for Bicester Eco Town or Bicester Garden Town, Garden City, They also own the land on Graven Hill, which is the largest self-build project in the country. So they are only the planning authority for Bicester. They're not the landowner, which is a very important distinction. They're the social housing provider called Compendium Living, and a development corporation in London, Old Oak and Park Royal. And finally, we're working very closely with the Urban Land Institute, whose members include some of the largest real estate companies in the world. So we're going to be speaking via them to Argent, who are responsible for King's Cross, British Land, and Hafen City, which is the largest regeneration project in Europe. The reason I mention all that is because that equates to our sort of third stage there, which is actually, the research project is just in two halves, really. It's the economic valuation followed by the exploration of barriers and opportunities. So going in reverse order, we're going to be speaking to all those delivery agencies and potentially more. We haven't yet quite defined what the scope of the project is yet. What their barriers, why are they not able to create healthy urban environments? But in order to open that door to conversations with senior decision makers in each of those organisations, we're going to be carrying out an economic valuation. And this is not necessarily the tricky bit, but it's certainly a challenge. So we know that there are direct causal links, as they're called in the medical establishment, and I don't have a medical background, so forgive me. We know there are direct causal links between, say, density of urban environment and car use and obesity. We know that there are direct causal links between air pollution and respiratory illness. So we know that, we can quantify that in monetary terms relatively straightforwardly. The challenge will be in how do you say, okay, we know that sort of those small pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, how do we try and get an aggregated picture of the whole? Once we have that, we can then go and start working with those decision makers. It is a pilot project. The feedback we got was that it was very ambitious. So who knows where it's going to go. If you've got any questions about that, please come up and ask me afterwards. There's a very quick canter through it. But I wanted to include two other research projects, which is more to do with climate adaptation, specifically, even though the Wellcome Project will include climate change as one of its health impact considerations. So this is a project funded by Innovate UK and the Natural Environment Research Council with the partners you can see on the right there. We were working with Asta Group. They're a sizable social housing provider, 28,000 properties, 200 million turnover, a 3 billion asset sale value. Now they'd been flooded 6 times, as in 6 properties were flooded in one flood event a few years ago. But it was a cost of £100,000. So for an organisation of their size, it wasn't a particularly significant event. There was some bad press locally. But actually, it was more the winds of change, the fact that they were hearing that other social housing providers had been very much more severely impacted. This is Sovereign, who were very severely hit by the 2007 floods, and I think either the 2010 or 2012, I can't remember. So there was buy-in at senior level from Asta Property. And also we worked very closely with their sustainability officers to make this happen. So the project had a number of different things that we were trying to do. We created a bespoke GIS-based system that allowed us to get client-specific data as to their risk profile. But actually the end result was about this. For me, again, it's all about the money, unfortunately. What is their exposure in financial terms? That's what we're interested in. So I can't actually reveal what that is because it's commercially sensitive. But it was significant enough to elicit this response from their risk manager, which was, I can see this moving preparedness for extreme weather significantly up the corporate agenda. What he actually said was, we don't really have climate change on our risk register at the moment, and this evidence will catapult it to the very top of our risk register. Obviously, it's different for every client, and he also caveated that, this was back in February, he caveated that by saying, it sort of depends on where government is going at the moment with social housing, because welfare reform was on the horizon, and so they weren't quite sure. Is this number 1 risk or is it number 2 risk? As it turns out, it's number 2 risk because they've been absolutely, they are currently being brought down to size, you might say, depends on what your view is. But basically, they're trying to figure out what their corporate strategies are at the moment. Genesis, social housing provider, recently announced it's no longer going to be doing social housing, for example. So very significant corporate concerns that the social housing sector has. So we're going to revisit this in 6 to 12 months' time and see where we go. Off the back of that, and this is the final research project, this is also funded by Innovate UK and Natural Environment Research Council, a slightly different set of partners, also with University of Bath again, but working with, this time, Bristol Health Partners. Bristol Health Partners is a consortium of all the clinical commissioning groups, the NHS Trust, the two universities, and apparently uniquely, the City Council. Quite often you do get consortia of universities with health sector, but very rarely do you get it with a public authority. And since the Health and Social Care Act 2012, since local authorities now have responsibility for public health, this is now a new area of integrated research, if you like. So the challenge, just to say that they're relatively substantial. When you combine all their interests, they're obviously relatively substantial. The challenge on this project, we're basically doing exactly the same thing as we did in the last project, but with two very clear distinctions. One is we're looking at health costs. We're looking at the impact of climate change on health. So this could be from heat stress or flood risk, or could be impact of infrastructure. If a hospital can't get energy or it can't use the transport network, etc., what are the top costs in terms of health? So again, once we've got that economic evidence, it's then about working with the different corporate entities. But again, the challenge, and this is more the challenge, previously we were working with a single corporate entity. This time we're going to be working with multiple corporate entities, all of whom have different risk management processes, different corporate strategies. So trying to unpick that is going to be a real challenge. So just to summarize, that's all the research. Just to summarize, on a lighter note, the car is obviously one of the reasons why we have so much of these challenges in terms of obesity and pollution and all the rest of it. And yet, a slightly perverted side of me wonders whether this is also a sign of hope, in that 70 years ago, we didn't really have any cars on the streets, and now they cover the entire planet. So it gives you, I think, a sense of the ability of us as a species to scale up, and scale up incredibly quickly. But in order to do that, we need to deconstruct the conditions that allowed that sort of scaling to happen. And I think that absolutely sits within the governance structures of the private sector, the public sector, and wherever else you look. And just to back up this issue around the need for economic evidence, it's certainly not the be-all and end-all, and we're never going to be able to quantify everything at all. But currently, they're not working to our favour at all, and we need to make sure that they are. And just to give you a couple of bits of evidence, this is from the Modern Built Environment KTN Knowledge Transfer Network, a piece of work they did for the Environment Agency. Unless clients can see the financial benefits of investing in adaptation, as well as the potential costs of not adapting, they will be unwilling to spend money now or adapting for risks which are neither certain nor clear. This is something repeated by MIT. This was a global survey they did of local authorities and why they're not doing anything about climate change adaptation. There's lack of engagement with economic actors. And the Royal Society came out last year saying the same thing. Companies are urged to realise true cost of extreme weather. It's about linking this economic evidence, if we can create it, with specific corporate interest in order to try and galvanise change. And we do have the ability now to quantify these hidden costs and to value these things which aren't quite so easy to count. And with that evidence, hopefully, it's not the whole answer, but hopefully it can start getting discussions going at senior level and empower decision makers to start having the really important discussions. Thank you very much.